Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Dr. Bryan Carmody. Dr. Carmody is a lifelong Virginian. Born and raised in Richland, Virginia, he attended college at Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, where he majored in chemistry before attending medical school at the University of Virginia. During his medical training, he became fascinated with kidney disease and renal physiology. After completing his residency training at Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, he returned to UVA for a fellowship in pediatric nephrology, then came back to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters to join the Children's Kidney Center and to be part of Virginia's only freestanding children's hospital. One of the major themes of this podcast is attempting to reconcile the small world and the large world as they pertain to performance. The large world in medicine is clinical practice, where so many variables interact to influence outcomes. A standardized, multiple-choice test that an aspiring physician must take in medical school to assess his or her competency for licensure is an example of the small world, an inherently incomplete model or metric that seeks to predict performance in the larger, more chaotic world. Dr. Carmody has some unique insights about the manner in which medical licensure exams reflect the potential for clinical excellence. A metric or assessment that doesn't effectively reconcile the small and large world isn't necessarily harmless. The things we measure incentivize how we behave. Preparing for a test or exam should enhance performance in the large world, not divert time and resources away from the things that really matter. There is a great deal at stake in medicine, so voices like Dr. Carmody's are a refreshing reminder to ensure that practice patterns and training are evolving, not just staying the same because change requires effort and self-reflection. Please excuse the few seconds where we lost connectivity. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's podcast in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Here's Bryan Carmody. Dr. Carmody, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. So you are a pediatric nephrologist, and you're also the self-anointed sheriff of sodium. Would you mind talking a little bit about the educational path required to achieve that specialty, as far as, the amount of time you spend in the classroom, and then your internships and your fellowships? And essentially what I really want to know is, considering where you are right now and what you have to do on a daily basis, which parts of your training or education did you find most useful to prepare you for the realities of your job, as far as like the classroom model versus the apprenticeship model, or a little bit of both?
Absolutely, yeah. So I went to medical school for 4 years, and after that I did a 3-year residency in pediatrics, and that was followed by a 3-year pediatric nephrology fellowship before I entered practice. And, there's value to all of that, but honestly, it's really the residency and fellowship, that apprenticeship model that you suggested. That's really where you grow up and become a doctor and learn the skills that you need to take care of patients.
Okay, yeah, because pretty much any medical provider I speak to, regardless of their discipline or subspecialty or even their field, they always say that they learn the most either in their residency or the equivalent of residency. So I'm a physical therapist, and I felt like what I learned in the classroom was just sort of a rite of passage to get the opportunity to work with really good clinicians and learn from them and watch how they practice. So do you think that there's almost too much emphasis on the classroom or the theoretical aspect? I guess because to me, medicine is still a craft, even though there's a body of knowledge required for that. So do you think that maybe medical people in general go too overboard with the theoretical stuff, or do you think it's necessary to be a good practitioner?
I think that's an excellent question. I personally am a believer that you learn by doing. Whatever task you want to do, you learn by doing that task. If you want to learn to be a better horse rider, you do it by riding a bunch of horses. You don't do it by spending a month practicing how you're going to sit in the saddle, or another month how you're going to hold the reins. You do it. So I think that for complex fields, sure, there's definitely some fundamental knowledge that you need to use to to take those next steps. But that can't be all your training is.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads me to where I want to go, talking about standardized testing in medicine, which is something that you've been very, very critical of, particularly the way in which standardized tests for physicians are used for residency placement. So I want to read a quote because I think that you capture this so vividly, and then we can talk about it. This is from one of your blog articles. You said, "By using Step 1 scores in residency selection, we have taken a test that was intended to serve a useful purpose, to make a binary decision on a physician's appropriateness for licensure, and turned it into a high-stakes medical trivia competition. The increasing focus on Step 1 crowds out more important content from both the medical school curriculum and the thought space of our medical students. It's hurting the quality of our undergraduate medical education, and by extension, may hamper graduate medical education and even patient care. And worst of all, it's getting worse, and there's no natural sight and end." So that's a lot to digest. And I want to start with asking what seems like an obvious foundational question, but I don't think it's so obvious when we talk about some of the complexity that accompanies testing later on. But in a vacuum, like, what should be the point or the reason for these standardized tests? And again, it's not a rhetorical question.
Yeah, you're right. So the USMLE, like you probably know, is the United States Medical Licensing Examination. It's intended to be a licensing exam. We live in a country where you can't just call yourself a doctor and hang out a shingle and start practicing. And that's for good reason, to protect us all from charlatans and snake oil salesmen. There's a process of licensure that physicians have to go through, which is good. It ensures quality for patients. It ensures, public confidence in physicians as a group. So the USMLE, like you said, it serves a useful purpose, but over time, I think the purpose of that test has been shifted toward other uses for which it was not intended, and frankly, it doesn't function well for either.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about what the other steps are, and at what point maybe the formal credentialing process, at least in a specialty like yours, becomes more realistic or better, paints a better picture of how you could be a better specialist in your day-to-day job?
Sure. So there's multiple steps to this. So, what I've been most critical of is, as I mentioned, is the United States Medical Licensing Exam. So that is a 4-part examination that you have to pass all of that in order to be considered for licensure. In the United States, whether you can have a medical license that's a power that's delegated to the states. That's not a centralized power of the government. So individual states have to make that decision with their medical boards, but they use the USMLE as a common measuring stick to decide if someone is appropriate for licensure. Now, beyond that, once you have a medical license, you can pursue, board certifications in whatever your field is. So for me, I'm certified by the American Board of Pediatrics for general pediatrics and for pediatric nephrology. And those additional board certifications are things that have come under fire recently as well. They used to be something that was used as more of a badge of honor or quality, and they've more or less become mandatory, and lots of other people have commented on how the main people who benefit from that system, it seems like, are the credentialing bodies themselves.
Okay, and so Step 1 is the part that you've been most critical about. So for the people who aren't familiar with it, what does Step 1 test, or what information does Step 1 hold an aspiring physician accountable for, and what is it about the content of that test that you find sort of objectionable, or at least the aspects that are emphasized?
So a quick overview of the USMLE. Step 1 is the first step, and the most important step for 2 reasons. Number one, because you can't take the others if you don't pass it. But then actually the main use of Step 1 that I've been critical about is its use in residency selection. So most students in the United States take Step 1 after their first 2 years of medical school, and the content of the test is generally basic sciences. The intention of the test is to provide, or to ensure that you have an understanding of the fundamental basic sciences that's necessary to proceed in medical training. And that Step 1 is then followed by Step 2, clinical knowledge, which is another multiple choice test that tests clinically relevant content. And then there's another part of Step 2 called Step 2 CS that is a standardized patient encounter. And then Step 3 is sort of the summative test that determines your ability to practice. But by far, students put the most time and effort into Step 1, not because the material that it tests is the most important necessarily, but because the timing of that test has allowed it to become an instrument that's used to measure candidates for residency selection.
Okay. So presumably the point of any of these standardized tests or licensure exams is to establish or enforce a minimum level of competency so that you're ensuring that people who practice medicine and any of these subspecialties are safe and they're not going to hurt anybody. But so, and I'm making a lot of assumptions here, and correct me if any of these assumptions are wrong, but if that is indeed the case, or if we take that as true, then shouldn't any practicing physician be able to pass, as an example, Step 1 of the USMLE without any preparation? Because presumably by virtue of the fact that they are physicians practicing safely, they would be sort of applying that information on a daily basis. So should that be the case? And based on those assumptions, do you think it is indeed true that any physician should be able to or could pass Step 1 of the boards of the USMLE right now without any preparation, assuming they've been out of school for like 5 years or more?
Right. That's such a good question because, like you said, I mean, if we're testing knowledge and skills that you actually use in the real world, then you'd think that doctors should be able to pass the test. I mean, that's certainly the case with other things like, I don't know. I mean, I could take my driver's license exam again, and I ought to be able to pass.
Sure.
If I did pass, it would raise legitimate questions about whether I should be on the road or not. But I would put it to you that that's definitely not the case with Step 1. And in fact, people who challenge me on that, if you want to step up and be humbled, I would encourage you to go back and take some Step 1 practice questions. I had that experience here recently because of my teaching responsibilities at the medical school. I wanted to be sure the content that I was providing the students for their kidney module was what was going to be on the test. So I went back and looked through a bunch of Step 1 questions. To be fair, there were a lot of things that I knew out of hand because they're things that do provide foundation for decisions that I make on a daily basis. On the other hand, there was material in my own specialty, in nephrology, that was so esoteric that I don't remember ever knowing it. I certainly don't know it now. And so to have material like that on the test, it makes me wonder, I mean, who benefits from that? If the nephrologist who's in clinical practice doesn't even use that material, why does the aspiring orthopedic surgeon or dermatologist have to know that in order to get into a residency?
Yeah, totally. And I know that you're pretty well read on some of the research that seeks to validate some of these tests. So as far as you know, is there any evidence that these types of tests, and in this case, Step 1 of the USMLE, actually does what it says that it does? Because people who sort of defend the status quo will often say, well, like, this is the test. Do you have any evidence that what you're counter-proposing is effective? But I would argue that there isn't necessarily any evidence that the status quo is effective. So, like, where should the burden lie? Should the burden lie with the people who are defending the current test or the people who are trying to change the test?
Yeah, you make a couple of excellent points there. So I think the first question, I mean, what evidence do we have that the Step 1 is an effective exam? I think it's minimal at best. Most of the evidence that people sometimes cite as saying, oh, well, Step 1 scores are useful because of such and such paper. You look at the paper, what the paper is comparing Step 1 scores to is some other standardized test, such as an in-service exam during residency or subsequent board passage. So it's sort of a little bit of a circular logic. It's not clear that you're measuring something different, and I don't think that you're measuring something that matters to patients either. I mean, I know a little bit about your work, and I know you're interested in athletic performance. So I mean, you could make an analogy about if you wanted to find out who was a good athlete, you might have a group of people run a 5K. And then a few years later, you might come back and have them run a half marathon. I mean, would you be surprised that the people who did well on one did well on the other? I mean, you're sort of measuring the same thing, right? And that's just one domain out of what makes a good athlete. And that's sort of the circular logic that we have in step one as well.
Yeah, and that's what's really tricky. I mean, because to use an analogy from my field, if you look at a team sport where there's so many variables that influence performance, I think that somebody with decent amount of experience can watch a game and see who the better performers are. But oftentimes that type of subjectivity, because it's very hard to quantify a complex phenomenon like basketball or football, and we have stats, and even like in the NFL, there's the NFL Combine where these college players are being tested in their ability to run like the 40-yard dash and some very predictable change of direction drills. But oftentimes certainly there's a minimum level of physiology and athleticism that's required to play these sports at the highest level. But whether or not running like a 4.1 second 40-yard dash versus a 4.4 or even a 4.5 makes a significant difference on the football field is very it's dubious at best. And yet that's these tests are used to draft players when millions of dollars are at stake, and a lot of times even people who are very experienced tend to overvalue some of these metrics because they are presumably objective and they're quantifiable, but whether or not they're meaningful, I mean, to me that's the major question in almost any field. Is like something like what you do is very, very complex, and you could probably you train residents, you could say based on your experience, well, I think this person would be a good fit for the job. But it's much more difficult to make one single multiple choice test that encompasses all the things that you think are important on a large scale where you're trying to be fair and not totally subjective. So I get some of the difficulties in doing this very well, but at the same time, I think we often put too much faith in some of the numbers just because it can be easy to measure some things, but it doesn't mean that they're that important. So any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree entirely with all that. I mean, I think your example is very apt. I mean, we all get excited. I mean, I'm an NFL fan. We all get excited about all these 40 times at the combine, but that's not really something that approximates playing football. I mean, you don't see people take off and run for 40 yards very often, You asked me a minute ago about where the burden of proof lies, and I think that's an excellent question, and I would argue that the burden of proof lies with the testing body themselves, because it's the National Board of Medical Examiners, it's the testing body who is warranting to the public that their test matters. They're the ones saying that it measures what it says that it does. And I think the problem there is that these licensing exams in medicine have sort of been grandfathered in over time. The USMLE has existed since 1993, but it replaced a number of other standardized exams that have been used to evaluate physicians since the NBME started in the early 1900s. And the thing is, nowadays we look at things through a different lens of evidence than we used to require. Sometimes people forget. I mean, it's not even that long ago that the FDA did not require that new drugs had to show that they were safe or effective. That's only been around since the 60s. There's still medicines that we use today because it seems like they should work. They seem like a good idea, but they've actually never been proven to be beneficial. I feel like for most of these NBME exams, the reason that we do them now is because we did them last year. And the reason we did them last year is because we did them the year before. And there's not evidence, and there's not been any incentive to for the testing body to provide evidence because people haven't demanded it.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that there's obviously like a huge resistance to change with some of these tests, and it's not always because the test itself has been validated. I think there are political and financial reasons for why there's so much inertia, if you want to use that word. So you've talked quite a bit about like who the stakeholders are in some of these standardized tests. And so can you talk about, at least for the USMLE, who the stakeholders are, and then what would be at stake for them if, for example, the USMLE Step 1 was changed to purely a pass-fail exam as you advocate? It would obviously change the incentives quite a bit. So stakeholders, and then what's at stake if some of these measures that you've called for were to be implemented?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So basically, anyone who comes in contact or has their lives affected by the Step 1 is theoretically a stakeholder. So, the president of the NBME has highlighted in, a recent editorial in Academic Medicine in December some of these adverse effects to shareholders that he perceives. So, for example, residency directors who use Step 1 scores to make initial decisions about which candidates to interview. The reality for those folks is that they get many, many more applications than they need, and without some objective across-the-board graphic that they can apply, their job gets harder. So, you make the USMLE pass-fail. Those folks have more work. He has made the argument that another stakeholder would be students who come from lower tier medical schools or medical schools in other countries where without a big name school to accentuate their application, these students, he argues, need to have an objective measure like the USMLE exam to show that they're good. And I think that's spurious logic. I think it's something that I think these students are being sold a false bill of goods. I've written about that on my blog, but basically that kind of argument neglects the fact that students at the quote-unquote top-notch medical schools, they do very, very well on the USMLE. And I would argue that students who come from lower tier medical schools or international medical graduates, they don't need the USMLE to level the playing field. They need to be playing a different game, a game that actually measures what kind of physician they're going to be. I think the primary stakeholder whose interest would be adversely affected by a change to pass-fail would be the National Board of Medical Examiners itself. And that's also something that I've commented quite a bit on in Twitter and other venues. The NBME is a nonprofit organization. However, its executives and many of its employees are very highly compensated. And they've had quite a bit of growth in their organization that's been related to the growth and interest in USMLE Step 1. I think it's important to note when I make this point, sometimes people say, well, the number of test takers is pretty fixed. And it's not that they're deriving the profits from. There's two important things to consider. Number one is that the NBME makes quite a bit of money selling sort of associated products. So, for example, my medical school uses something called Customized Assessment Services, or CAS, which allows us to use NBME test items to build exams for our students. And the students, in a sense, pay for it, with their tuition. I don't know there'd be a demand for that product if students weren't so worried about their USMLE Step 1 scores. Faculty would just write the test questions like they did in the old days, and there wouldn't be any extra expense necessarily associated with that. A number of students in preparation for the USMLE Step 1 also buy self-assessment exams from the NBME, and so that's another source of revenue that would likely dry up a little bit, if there weren't such an emphasis on it. The other thing, though, is that, the NBME and the USMLE's primary customer is the state medical boards themselves. And it turns out that a number of states, actually, the legislative act that establishes the medical board, I guess sort of through a poor use of word choice, has required that the state board use USMLE scores in making licensing decisions. And thus, if the USMLE were to become a pass-fail test, there would be certain states who would not be able to accept USMLE scores any longer. Now, they certainly could petition their legislature to, amend the language in those acts. But I think probably some medical boards would be reluctant to do that because they wouldn't necessarily want the legislature to be completely reviewing the act that makes them exist. And so it raises the possibility that individual states or some other entity would come out with a new exam that would challenge the NBME's and USMLE's market dominance, because right now, since 1993, they've had a complete monopoly on testing for allopathic medical graduates. So I would argue that if you look where the dollars are going, the person or the entity that would get hurt the worst by a pass-fail USMLE is going to be the National Board of Medical Examiners itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it just highlights the fact that in a vacuum, it's easy to criticize this stuff, but when you see how many obstacles there are to change and how many stakeholders, it makes it much more difficult. I was reading one of your articles, and you referenced a quote from somebody that was associated with either the USMLE or the National Board of Medical Examiners. And it was something very paternalistic. It was about like how if some of these reforms that people like you advocate, then students would spend more of their time on Netflix and not actually like studying to become physicians. What was that quote, and like what was the context for that? Because it showed just like to me a complete cluelessness, as if like the job of a medical educator is just to keep people really busy and to sort of like monopolize their time.
Yeah, yeah. It's an awful quote. I think it speaks for itself. So basically, this was published, as you mentioned, by the president of the National Board of Medical Examiners and the president of the Federation of State Medical Boards. So they wrote an article in the journal Academic Medicine, and this appeared online first in December, right before Christmas. This was an invited commentary. So this is something that the journal's editors had asked them to write, and they were supposed to write in response to an article that appeared from medical students. And both of these articles, honestly, if this is an issue that you care about at all, both of these articles are worth reading in their entirety. The medical student argument was highlighting, it was from, I think, six maybe medical students from different schools around the country describing their perception and experience of how this over-focus on Step 1 scores was hurting their education and hurting their mental health and not making them better doctors. And they end with a sort of a call to consider making the USMLE pass-fail. So it was in response to that Drs. Katsifrakis and Chaudhry wrote their editorial in which they highlighted negative effects on other stakeholders, and naturally the negative effects that they highlighted sort of all go in favor of keeping a scored USMLE. But the most ludicrous of those, and I've challenged several of them, online. If you're interested in those, it's at my thesheriffofsodium.com blog. But the worst was the one saying that if we made USMLE Step 1 pass-fail, then students would have extra time on their hands because they spend so much time studying for that now. And that'd be a good thing if students spent that time engaged in pursuits that made them better doctors. But if they spent their time, I believe the language was incessantly updating their Instagram accounts or binge watching the latest Netflix, then it would ultimately impact patient safety.
Yeah, and so that type of quote reflects to me a pretty antiquated mindset, which I want to transition to in a second. But before I do that, I want to just be very clear that I don't think that a test is necessarily corrupt because the financial transaction is made or there's money involved. And I'm all for if there's a good product that provides value to include a medical screening test or licensure exam, that I think people should be paid for it. But I think that said, it's still these issues warrant some scrutiny. So I just wanted to say that. It's kind of stating the obvious, but I don't want people to say, well, this guy doesn't think that these tests should make any money. I think they should, but they should do what they say that they do.
I agree entirely there, and I would make sometimes people have asked me what I think about like the for-profit USMLE prep industry, and to be perfectly frank, I take less issue with them because they operate in an unregulated free market space. I mean, if you want to buy their product, you can, and if you don't, then don't. And normal market forces apply to the transactions that are made. I mean, if I want to come out with a new test prep book, then I know that I've got to make either a better book than First Aid for the USMLE, which is the dominant product on the market. I got to make a better book, or I got to make a book that comes in at a lower price point, and then people can choose. But the thing about the USMLE is that the prices are fixed, and there's no competition, and there's really no regulation on on any of the financial transactions that take place. And so I don't mean to suggest that the executives at the NBME are greedy or corrupt either. I think that they're normal people just like you and me. They're people who they want to take care of their families, they want to keep their job, they want to get promoted, they want to please their bosses, and they believe in their mission. But I think that the whole reason that I'm able to get their financial information is because they're a nonprofit organization. And as such, we live in a country where nonprofit organizations have to publicize their some of their financial tax records. So for this very reason, for public scrutiny, so that people, external stakeholders can look at it and say, your dollars don't align with your mission. Your dollars don't align with the value that you're supposed to be giving to society.
Yeah, and certainly no human organization is infallible, but at least having competition sort of keeps us all in check. And what you're suggesting is that there isn't a lot of competition when it comes to some of these testing conditions.
Exactly, and like I said, if you follow out the logic of why the National Board of Medical Examiners may be particularly uninterested in a pass-fail test, it's because it would open up, or it potentially might open up the marketplace to a competitor, which would really destabilize their entire enterprise.
Okay, and so you mentioned in that quote that you referenced earlier, Instagram was alluded to, and I think maybe even Netflix, and so these are obviously pretty new phenomena. Now, this is even though the USMLE is relatively new, and you said it was like 1993, it's sort of based on other standardized tests that preceded it, and most standardized tests, at least the ones that I've encountered in my career, tend to be very memorization based. And if I'm being honest, like a lot of the material I just brain dumped after the test to make room for the next batch of information I had to memorize for whatever I was going to encounter later on. So in 2019, where you can pretty much look up any fact or piece of information in 30 seconds on a smartphone, do you think that there's still a role for memorization-based tests right now?
Yeah, I think you touched on a very, very important issue. I was reflecting on that actually for a class that I was teaching for our medical students maybe about a year or so ago, and I was thinking back to when I was first sort of getting interested in medicine. I would shadow an internist in my hometown, and so I would go with him to his hospital rounds in the morning and see some morning clinic patients. Then he'd take a break for lunch and then see more clinic patients in the afternoon, and then back to the hospital before the end of the day. Well, over his lunch break, he would sit in the little workroom in the office and eat his sandwich, and he would spend his time reading through the physician's desk reference. When I tell this story to medical students now, that they don't even know what I'm talking about because they've never seen one. So this guy, he would sit there on his lunch break and read the physician's desk reference, and he did it because it mattered. That knowledge that he had in his head was valuable knowledge. It was knowledge that helped his patients because you couldn't possibly look that stuff up in that giant book every time that you needed to look it up through the day. He had to memorize it. Well, now all that hard-won knowledge that he's acquired over years of doing that, all the sacrifice and everything, it's more than replaced by a free iPhone app. So I think we have to question, things that were extremely valuable in the past may not be so much now. There's much more value these days for physicians who can critically evaluate evidence and put knowledge into context, and those are things that are not really assessed by multiple choice exams.
Yeah, maybe you've had a similar experience, but I just feel like for me, the limiting factor in my ability to get an outcome with a patient, besides behavioral change and connecting on a human level, is pattern recognition. So not necessarily like lack of information or missing out on a fact, but it's the ability to make connections between those facts. And if I forget a fact, I look it up, but I still have to connect those dots. And granted, it's much harder to create a valid and reliable test that measures pattern recognition and the ability to make connections. But it just seems like, and this is going to tie into the next thing I want to ask you, where we're satisfied with these tests because they provide a number, and that makes it presumably objective. And when it comes to residency placement, you've talked about how a lot of residencies have effectively outsourced their selection or their talent evaluation to these tests because they haven't been able to figure out what's important to them internally. So you've made the point that these tests correlate with things that might correlate with something that's related to the practice of medicine. So it correlates with another test. But no one, or for the most part, most people aren't really establishing what is it that's important to us when it comes to selecting talent. So, I mean, if you were in charge of like a pediatric nephrology residency and you weren't constrained by some of these regulations and and testing parameters, I mean, how would you go about selecting residents? What criteria, more sort of abstract, not specific to nephrology, but what metrics would you use? And also keep in mind that you're going to be evaluating potentially hundreds of applicants, so it's got to be scalable. Hard question, I
Yeah.
know.
No, it's a great question. I mean that gets at so many good things, and you had so many things actually in the lead up that I wanted to to talk about too. I think one thing to sort of highlight for sort of a lead into that discussion is the point that you make about USMLE step scores are not entirely valueless. I mean, what I mean is that overall, I mean, you see lots of very good residents who do very, very well on, on step one. I don't think that it has the first thing in the world to do with, the material that's on step one. I mean, take for example, orthopedic surgeons. Orthopedic surgery residents have among the highest USMLE step one scores as a group of, almost any specialty. There's vanishingly little on step one that has any relevance to the day-to-day practice of orthopedic surgery. I mean, there's very little. But I think we can sometimes be tricked into thinking that the step one score is very helpful in helping you find good residents, because to achieve that score, you've got people who were able to persevere. They had some threshold amount of intelligence. They had single-minded focus on a task, and they achieved this good score. So I think what you're measuring is, and sort of deluding yourself about, is that you're picking good residents because of the step one score, when in fact, like you said, it's something that's collinear with something else. So the only problem with that, I guess actually there's two problems with that kind of logic, or using scores in that way. Number one is that we don't know what those coefficients are. So is there some collinearity with those things? Yeah, I don't doubt it for a bit that there are desirable traits that run in parallel with your ability to score a giant step one score. But we don't know what those coefficients are, so that makes it hard to assess those numbers accurately. And I think the second problem is that we're making an assumption that there's not value lost to the individual or to society by all this step one prep, because everybody's only got a certain amount of time in the day. And so even if it's true that our best and brightest are excelling on step one because they're our best and brightest, is that really how they should be spending their time? Is that really how society is going to reap the most benefit? Is that really what their patients are going to thank us for in the future? Because I would put it to you that, that the answer is no. Now, as far as what we should measure, I mean, I think that's an outstanding question. Because there's so many other things that are more important, but those things are hard to measure. And I think we have to start by being very introspective about what makes a good doctor, and we need to understand sort of at the outset that that's going to vary from discipline to discipline, because being a good surgeon or a good radiologist is going to be very different than being a good nephrologist. But the people who are in the best position to decide to be a part of that introspection are people in those specialties themselves. And I love the word you used about outsourcing, because that's exactly what we're doing with the USMLE Step 1 scores. We're outsourcing a job that is hard, and we don't want to do it ourselves, and so we pay someone else to do it, and that's not how we should be. You mentioned something earlier, though, that kind of resonated with me when you were describing looking at athletes. And, I mean, this may be a little choppy because I'm just sort of thinking about this a little bit now, but when you talk about the NFL Combine, sometimes it's easier to look at a player and say that this person is a good player without being able to exactly specify a metric that they're better on.
Totally.
You know what I mean? And I mean, I see that all the time. My son is very into soccer, and so I spend time watching, soccer games with him. And, I never played soccer. I don't know much about it, but I'll tell you, there are times when I see players and I can very clearly tell that they're, either in his games or on the games we watch on TV, that they're a step ahead. They've got something different that the other players don't have. To me, I almost wonder whether we would do better with this kind of task with some kind of machine learning, where we take physicians who are good physicians, or residents who are good residents, just like we might say this person's a good soccer player, and we feed into a machine all the pieces of information that we have about that person, and then let the machine figure out what is it that we missed. I mean, because there's lots of things that could be measured, but when you try to build something from the ground up, it's sometimes hard to specify on the front end how you should weight all these different characteristics. I mean, you've got to be fast to play soccer, but is there a certain level of speed where that really is going to hinder you? I mean, if you have good balance and hand-eye coordination and ability to respond to coaching and other things, it seems like that would be a good task for for some computer people to help us out with.
No, that's a great point, because there's so much subjectivity in this, and I think a lot of times, like you said, we can identify what looks quote unquote good, but we can't always articulate it, and it becomes very hard to take what passes our eye test or satisfies us subjectively and then reverse engineer all these metrics to get to that point. And maybe that is, I mean, look, I'm not saying that artificial intelligence is going to solve all our problems. I think that there's some things about AI that are problematic even from like an ethical standpoint, but we have to at least ask these questions, and hopefully they're being asked internally. But I think you made a great point too, as far as that, like, just like in medicine as a rule, for the most part, no intervention is harmless. Like, there's unintended consequences and a downside to doing pretty much anything. So even a test that presumably, like, let's say we can determine that the USMLE or some of these standardized tests, like the ones I took, don't actually do what they say they do, but we're saying that they're not harmful per se. But I would argue that if it doesn't do what it says that it does, then it is harmful, because you've diverted resources and time into preparing for that test. And that's time that could have been spent. We live in a world, right, with finite resources. So that's time and money that could have been spent doing something more valuable. So and obviously when you utilize these tests, you incentivize people to pass the test, and your training is going to be somewhat guided by the constraints or the parameters of those tests. So assuming that you could test people in the way that you wanted, how would you change, or how do you think medical education should change to prepare people for what they're really going to encounter and need to do versus just preparing for a test? So, like, how do you think that the curriculum should be modified to meet sort of some of the objectives that you think are more important from a clinical standpoint?
Yeah, those are extremely important issues that I think everybody is kind of wrestling with, right now. Because as you said, the reality of medical school is that it's 4 years, and I guess kind of touching on a point that we made before, the important thing to appreciate about that is that medical school is 4 years long, but it's been 4 years long for about the last 100 years. I recently read the old Flexner report. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically Abraham Flexner was a guy who 100 years ago got tasked with evaluating medical education in the United States. And so he went around to all the medical schools that were in existence at the time and found that many of them were doing lots of good things, and many of them were almost hardly better than having nothing at all. And so he wrote this report about what medical schools should be, and it sort of created the model of medical education that we've emulated ever since then. So the Flexner idea of medicine was to have this, these 2 years of preclinical education, and then spend 2 years seeing patients, and then move on into practice or formal training in other areas. Kind of evolved over time. But when you read the Flexner report, I mean, it gets into very nitty-gritty details about what different schools were doing in their curricula. So some of the schools that he was very impressed with Harvard Medical School and Johns Hopkins, and he would specify out what they were doing in their curriculum. Well, those people in those days, I mean, they spent hundreds of hours learning anatomy. And we don't have any less anatomy now than we did 100 years ago. I mean, there's just as much anatomy to learn now as there was in 1916. I mean, it's just that in Flexner's time, obviously, there wasn't as much pharmacology or physiology or genetics or anything else that we know about now that we didn't know about then. But medical school is still 4 years long. So I think, to get back to your question, I mean, the first thing that we have to accept is that you just can't keep adding things to medical school. That's not the way to do it. We are at the point where you have to make hard decisions about what are you going to cut. I mean, if you want to add something, what are you going to cut? And to decide, how we're going to do that, I think you have to look at medical education as being something that produces a public good. So what can we teach that on the other side is going to increase the maximum benefit to society, to society as a whole and to patients? What can we do educationally that facilitates that? And I think that we're going to have to reconsider this whole sort of Flexnerian model of what medical school should look like. I think the reality of medical practice these days is that medicine is becoming so increasingly specialized and subspecialized that the idea that all physicians should have a core knowledge is at least more challenged, and how broad that core should be, because I don't know, how much nephrology do you really need to know to be a good, ophthalmologist? I don't know, probably not that much, to be honest. Would your patients be better off by having students sort of specialize a little bit earlier and do more like colleges where, you have a certain amount of core requirements, but pretty early people differentiate into what they want to be when they're grown up. And so, you may have core requirements, but pretty soon the chemistry major is taking something different than the econ major, because that's going to benefit them more in the long run. So I think that, I honestly don't know how best to do it, but I think that we have to begin that conversation without any preconceived ideas about what things should look like.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up duration of education, because it would seem like with all the technological advances in education that medical education and undergraduate education and all these other forms of education should be getting shorter, not longer, because, yeah, you can make a case in 1950 that school should be longer because people had no way to access information quickly but to memorize it, but that's not the case anymore, right? We have all this information that's accessible instantaneously, but there's also like a kind of a financial and a political arms race going on in medicine where there are a lot of fields, particularly in primary care, where there is a shared market, right? And there's a lot of overlap between the professions. And this is just, it kind of rolls downhill where duration of education is often deemed synonymous with safety and competence. And, every profession that has a longer amount of training than the one beneath it will say, well, if they're doing similar things and share a similar market, they'll say, well, those people are unsafe. They don't have as much training as us. When in reality, the safety aspect of it is questionable. It's more, they just don't want somebody who spent less time and money going to school doing the same thing and potentially taking, patients or clients from them. And so, and a good example would be, let's say if medical school was lowered from 4 years to 3 years or even 2 years, then from a primary care standpoint, PAs and nurse practitioners and physical therapists could say, oh, look, like what we do is exactly the same as them. Now, our school was 3 years too, and then we should make as much money as them, or, the physician should make less money. And so there's a lot of, I think, unnecessary infighting in medicine. It's not necessarily related to patient advocacy, even though it's called patient advocacy. It's very specious. It's more about how do we protect ourselves? And I get that every profession has to protect itself professionally and politically to a certain degree, but how do you think that some of these financial and political and systemic issues are influencing medical education, either for better or for worse? Because I think there's more to it than just here's the knowledge that you need to be a competent provider. I think that in some cases, having there's a lot of financial and political incentive to have longer programs so that you can say that your training is superior to somebody else's, even though duration is not necessarily equivalent to competence. So kind of long question, but does that make sense?
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things there. I mean, a lot of complex issues. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, at the end of the day, medicine needs to be about patients. It's not about, protecting your business interests. And I think that, I don't know, if you examine history, it's going to be writ large with examples of protectionist impulses sort of gone wrong. And in the long run, that stuff doesn't look good on you. And I think that the real question, is the one that you posed. Is, if the outcome for a particular patient is the same with one person doing it and another person doing it, then that's the outcome that matters. And trying to make artificial barriers to that, I'm not sure that that's I don't think that that's going to benefit the people that we're really trying to benefit, being the patients. I think that probably the bigger problem, driving all of that is that, for most of us, we still live in a fee-for-service world where, the more you do, the more you make. And if that's the model, then people are going to do more, and lots of people smarter than I am have written and thought about this a lot, but I think that we have to align what our real objectives are with our financial goals. We have to align, quality of patient care with the dollars. And until we do that, I think we're always going to have these perverse incentives that don't end up benefiting our patients.
Yeah, these are obviously very hard questions, but I just know, for example, like in my case, I'll get emails from my governing body, and it's like, hey, there's this bill where they want to grant athletic trainers more professional autonomy in New York. Like, here's how to write your congressman to block it. And I'm kind of like, I like competition, so I don't think that necessarily like athletic trainers who they have a lot of overlap to like what I do professionally are necessarily going to be hurting people if they have more professional autonomy. So I kind of welcome the competition, and I think that patients in the market, as long as certain minimum safety standards are met, are going to dictate like what's effective and what's not. So everyone's trying to block somebody else. And like I said, it kind of rolls downhill, but oftentimes like it'd be one thing if these professions just said, look, like we're trying to protect our market share. I can respect that because it's more transparent and honest, but I don't like the smearing of other professions, whether it's, ones that do it to mine or when my profession does it to another one where it's like, oh, well, these people are unsafe when there's no evidence to suggest that's true. When it's really, that's just kind of, it's this sort of fake patient advocacy. It's like, well, we're all about protecting the patient when really they're trying to protect themselves. And, you could even make an argument that, if you could remove some of these professional boundaries in primary care, where if people wanted to specialize later on, maybe like everybody, all aspiring PAs and nurse practitioners and physicians, physiology is physiology. They could all go to the same school initially and then subspecialize based on their interests and their talent and that kind of thing. But there's probably, in my opinion, almost too much professional redundancy in too many professions, and everyone's kind of fighting for their piece of the pie. And I think that comes at a cost.
I agree completely. Yeah, and that's a fact about the licensing exams that that I didn't highlight before. I think that their most important purpose is just what you said. It's ensuring public confidence in the profession and ensuring public patient safety. But we can be honest too and say that there's value by keeping a closed shop. And I guess I agree. It helps to be transparent about that because that's the only way you can sort of work these things out.
Yeah, we're coming up on time here, but is there anything else that you want to add that you think is important that maybe I didn't think of to ask as far as some of these issues go?
Not right off the top of my head. It's stuff that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I know people. I've heard from many people who have different thoughts on these issues, and I'm happy to hear from you. I really am, because it shapes and hones my thinking on these issues too. So if you disagree, please feel free to to email me or tweet at me, because I honestly would like to hear from you.
Yeah, where can people learn more about the work that you do and some of your writing? I know you've got like the Twitter and you've got your website. So maybe if you could just kind of point people to those resources, so if they wanted to interact with you, they could.
Yeah, definitely. So from time to time, I put things out on Twitter, and that's at JB Carmody, JBCARMODY. And then recently, to sort of document in a more permanent way some of the stuff that started on Twitter, I have a blog or website, which is thesheriffofsodium.com.
I like that. Yeah. Not on my watch.
I was shocked that the domain name was available, but
right.
I snapped it up for anyone who was hoping to get that.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time and your insight. Obviously, these are very difficult questions, and I am not claiming to have the answers, and I don't think you are either. But I think that it's worth just at least highlighting some of these issues just to generate discussion. So thanks again, and look forward to interacting with you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.